may cover this in your book, I don't know, but did the decision in 2015 to sell the company to the Chinese have anything at all to do with the bad press they had gotten, or was it just monetary?
No, they made so much money. Yeah.
So someone gave them an offer they couldn't refuse.
Yeah. Yeah, it was all about the money. Yeah.
Everybody feels good now, right?
So there's a whole, there's a whole bigger picture for you business enthusiasts out there of the Chinese purchasing this and their demand for pork, and the exporting of this process. What's disturbing to me is they purchased the process that I've described. They've purchased that so that they could implement that in China and reproduce that in China, because they have tremendous problems raising hogs in China, and there have been a lot of hog kills where I can't remember the name of the river, but the hog carcasses just float down, and they have a lot of trouble keeping hogs alive. So they're very interested in the industrial hog complex system, and they have a very high demand for pork. So, anybody else? All right. Oh, yes, sir.
I taught sociology at Hampton University for 30 years, and for a lot of that time, I used Charlie Ledoux's articles in the New York Times to illustrate the way that employers, capitalists, pit black workers against immigrant workers, and in general, the way that racism is a strategy against the working class that is pervasive in capitalist society and perfected more throughout the history of the United States than any place else. And there's an earlier chapter in this industry, after all, in the 1920s and 30s, when this industry was mostly in Chicago area and Iowa, and the battle to unionize that industry back then included a very large role by socialists and communists who took on the same issue of workers being pitted against each other by race and ethnicity, and they built some of the most progressive and successful unions at that time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Before they were, and then during the Cold War, they were driven out of the unions, and by the 1950s and 60s, you had this scenario that leads into what you talk about. But I think there's sort of a deeper point here, really, which is that it's not just horrific, corrupt employers and horrible racist scenarios, but I don't know about you. I'm 75 years old now. I think that these features are inherent in a capitalistic society. It's what capitalists do. They will never stop doing it. They own the government, and the government will never stop helping them do it. So there's no way that this can be ended without ending this system that we all live under. And to eliminate the exploitation of labor, you've got to eliminate capitalism, which is what's based on.
Or regulate it fiercely. I mean, there's obviously problems with communism too. But your point about the conflation, and what's fascinating to me in this book is in the South, the conflation of racism and communism and anti-unionism that you don't find in the old Union belts, where there was a point in time where black and white workers combined forces and worked together with unions. But in the South, the cotton mills did not employ black workers until the 60s. And in this case, when I had this book in development at ODU, and I read a chapter, and there was an African-American man in my class, and he said, "What year are you writing about?" I said, "This was in the 1990s." And he said, that just can't be true. I mean, the racial slurs and the environment in the plant is really shocking. Or as one reviewer said, jaw-dropping. Yes?
Just to dovetail to your point, I think what you see specifically in the South as it relates to the climate, as it relates to race, I think when we look at the end of the Civil War, what we really need to say is that there was an end of organized military activities, right? There was an end of military conflict. But as far as the sociological, academic, and economic warfare, it persisted. So you look at what transpired during Reconstruction, you know, prior to the 1950s and 60s, you know, there was black political growth. You know, there were black elected congressmen, black elected senators, and then with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other racist groups who wanted to suppress that. And a lot of the laws as far as readmittance into the Union, as far as accepting people of color, you know, those laws were lax. So the South was allowed free reign to terrorize people of color. So I think even though military activities ended, they never stopped being at war with black folks. And because black folks did not have an apparatus to effectively push back against it, you know, even though slavery was gone, it was still systemic. So I think for a lot of poor whites, economically, they were never going to be at the level that they needed to be, which goes to what you were saying. But as long as there was the black that they could look down on and abuse, you know, they kind of allowed whatever exploitation to take place on them to persist because they had this community that they could always beat down. And I think as it relates to your book, as it relates how they try to replicate that process with undocumented workers and African Americans, but perhaps for African Americans, because they understood their treatment, that they decided that maybe we need to forge alliances. And I think that's what we're seeing politically now, is that there is this renaissance, so to speak, of weaponizing poor whites to view communities of color as an impending threat. Like we just saw this week with the president where he called immigrants animals.
Right.
You know, and the language that we describe, you know, undocumented immigrants, you know, we call them illegal aliens. These are human beings. So until we start having more humanistic, I didn't mean to take over.
No. That's okay. But
He gets fired up.
There's a story in the book that when we look at how this just repeats itself and repeats itself. And Joe Luter was, I'm not sure exactly, maybe 10 years old. The Gwaltney plant had a union vote. And when the people came to vote, and the union organizers came, and one of the union organizers was African American, and the sheriff said, you know, we haven't had a good lynching around here. Right? Now this was Joe Luter, the town, and this is what he grew up in, this atmosphere. And then they said, you know, something about, we haven't had any salty baths. We think we'll have some salty baths around here. You know, trying to intimidate the union organizers. And then when the workers came to vote, the sheriff deputies were standing there as they came in to vote, right? So this is intimidation. And that, you know, he was a boy when that happened. But you know, they were not having it, you know. And the NLRB, interestingly enough, the reason we have those records, and let me just say that the NLRB was great with this book. They gave me an entire 8,000 pages of transcripts in searchable form, and they gave me this case that they overrode that I guess it was 1940, something like that. And they overruled that vote because of intimidation, the NLRB did. And they also provided some documents that are not public that help with the book. So, but it just keeps repeating itself. And you know, white power is not going to let go, and they're going to do whatever they have to do to keep that stranglehold and keep
even
that control.
the exploitation of white people
Yes.
to maintain the power.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you